History is filled with figures who cast long, dark shadows, men of ambition, men of cruelty. Karl Peters was one such man. In the lands that would become German East Africa, his name was whispered with fear, Mukono wa Damu, the man with the bloody hand. In Germany he was known as Hangman Peters. His story is a stark reminder of the brutal reality of colonialism, unchecked power, racial arrogance, and devastating human cost. His ambition knew no bounds, and his methods knew no mercy. The light he brought was the flash of a rifle, and the shadow he cast was that of the gallows. His legacy is not one of discovery, but of destruction, written in the blood and tears of the people he subjugated. His shadow lingers, a warning from the past, and it is a story we cannot afford to forget. The year is 1884. The great powers of Europe gather in Berlin, not to discuss peace, but to carve up Africa. No Africans were invited. The continent was treated like a cake to be sliced and distributed. Germany, newly unified, was desperate to catch up. Chancellor Bismarck hesitated, but public pressure mounted. Germany needed an empire. That man was Karl Peters. He founded the Society for German Colonization, giving the government plausible deniability. Peters raised private funds, gathered a small group, and set his sights on East Africa. In autumn 1884, as the Berlin Conference began, Peters and his companions set sail for Zanzibar, traveling in disguise. The fate of millions would be shaped by the actions of this one ruthless man. The scramble for Africa was underway, and Peters was at its vanguard. The consequences would be felt for generations. Karl Peters arrived in East Africa with one goal: acquire land. He did not come to negotiate as an equal, he came to take. His method was crude: march into a village, find the chief, and present a treaty written in German. The chiefs, often illiterate, had no idea what they were signing. Intimidation and cheap gifts sealed the deal. These were not treaties, but fraudulent contracts obtained through deception and coercion. Peters boasted of acquiring vast territories in weeks, a triumph of German cunning, he claimed. He raced through Usaguha, Nguru, Usagara, and Ukami, collecting a dozen treaties. Legitimacy didn't matter. All that counted was a mark on paper. This paper became his proof of ownership, the foundation of German East Africa. Peters returned to Berlin in early 1885, presenting his acquisitions to Bismarck. The Chancellor, now a colonial convert, granted Peters an imperial charter. Overnight, 60,000 square miles became a German protectorate. Peters, once a private adventurer, was now an agent of the German state. He returned to Africa as Imperial High Commissioner, wielding immense power. He was the law, administering justice, raising taxes, commanding a police force. For the local people, the man who had tricked them was now their master. Fraudulent treaties were now backed by German military might. Peters's personal ambition had become state policy. His reign of terror was about to begin. The iron fist of empire had arrived, and it bore the mark of Hangman Peters. Once in power, Karl Peters ruled through fear, not administration. His headquarters became a place of summary justice and brutal punishment. He established forced labor, locals compelled to work on plantations, build roads, serve as porters. Refusal meant flogging, imprisonment, or worse. Peters believed only brute force could govern. His use of the gallows earned him his infamous nickname. Executions were ordered for the slightest infractions. No trials, just Peters, as judge, jury, and executioner. Public hangings created an atmosphere of terror. The Africans called him Mukono wa Damu, the man with the bloody hand. His personal conduct was monstrous. He took local women as concubines against their will. When he discovered what one, Jagodia, had a lover named Mabruk, he saw it as rebellion. He convened a sham court and sentenced both to death. Jagodia hanged, Mabruk shot. Even some Europeans were horrified, but Peters saw it as a necessary demonstration of power. Maintaining racial hierarchy was his obsession. The story of Jagodia and Mabruk spread, symbolizing his tyranny. Peters's reputation among Africans was cemented, a man without a soul, hands forever stained with blood. His rule was defined by cruelty, not order. The gallows became his signature, fear was his tool, and the region would never forget his name. Karl Peters's brutality sparked resistance. The Chaga and Meru peoples, proud and independent, began to organize. Small acts of defiance grew into open uprising, attacks on German outposts, refusal to provide labor or food. Peters responded with scorched earth tactics. Villages burned, Crops destroyed, famine deliberately created. No prisoners were taken, suspected fighters were executed on the spot. He exploited divisions among local groups, using divide and conquer to shatter the region's social fabric. For Peters, the uprising was a chance to demonstrate absolute power. Thousands died, killed in fighting, famine, or disease. Entire communities were displaced, their way of life destroyed. Peters documented his campaigns with chilling pride. Villages burned, people killed, all for the empire. For East Africa, it was an unforgettable nightmare. For Peters, it was the price of building an empire. While Peters was feared in Africa, he was celebrated in Germany. The nationalist press hailed him as a hero, a modern conquistador bringing civilization to Africa. His brutal methods were ignored or praised as necessary. Peters himself fueled this image, publishing books and giving lectures about his adventures. He exaggerated successes, justified violence, and tapped into racist attitudes. For the German government, Peters was useful. He delivered an empire and fueled public support for colonialism. Rumors of brutality were overlooked as long as he expanded German territory. The violence celebrated in Berlin was terror in Kilimanjaro. The disconnect allowed Germans to embrace empire without facing its cost. Peters became a symbol of ambition and of the moral blindness of imperial power. The man hailed as a pioneer at home was a murderer abroad. This contrast defined his legacy, and it revealed the true face of colonialism. The whispers of Peters's brutality could not be contained. Missionaries in East Africa sent letters home, describing hangings, floggings, and burned villages. The execution of Jagodia and Mabruk horrified even Europeans. These reports reached liberal and socialist circles in Germany, fueling criticism of colonialism. August Bebel and the Social Democratic Party seized on the scandal, denouncing Peters in Parliament. The government could no longer ignore the growing outcry. Hangman Peters became a political embarrassment. Reluctantly, the Colonial Office launched an inquiry. Peters was recalled from Africa in 1892 to face charges. He believed he would be exonerated, protected by his service to the empire. But the tide was turning. The myth of the colonial hero was cracking. The truth was too shocking to ignore. In 1896, Carl Peters faced a disciplinary court. The evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses described arbitrary executions, torture, and violent expeditions. The case of Jagodia and Mabruk was the centerpiece, a clear abuse of power. Peters defended himself, claiming his actions were necessary for order. But his arrogance and lack of remorse sealed his fate. In 1897, Peters was found guilty of misuse of power, stripped of his commission and pension, and dismissed in disgrace. The man who founded an empire was now an outcast. He fled to London, bitter and resentful. Officially disgraced, Peters remained a hero to some nationalists, who saw him as a martyr. Years later, his reputation was revived by the Nazis. Hitler celebrated him as a colonial pioneer. His fall from grace was only temporary in some circles, but for most, his legacy was forever tainted. The hangman of Africa had been condemned by his own government. His story was a warning about the dangers of unchecked power, and the shadow he cast would not easily fade. How should we remember Carl Peters today? His story forces us to confront the violence, racism, and exploitation at the heart of colonialism. Empires are not built on noble intentions, but on the suffering of others. In Germany, his legacy is contested, once celebrated, now largely forgotten or condemned. As Germany reckons with its colonial past, Peters' name re-emerges in debates about memory and reparations. For Tanzanians, his legacy is clear: Mkono wa damu, the man with the bloody hand, a symbol of oppression and violence. The stories of his cruelty are a painful part of collective memory. For them, he is not a complex figure. He is the man who brought the gallows. Peters' story is a moral lesson about the corrupting nature of absolute power. History is written by the powerful, but truth survives in the memories of the oppressed. To understand our world, we must look into the shadows of our past. We must listen to those who suffered, and we must have the courage to call men like Carl Peters what they were, architects of immense human suffering. Only then can we hope to learn from history's darkest chapters.